And I'm going to do an additional step of setup as usual. That's just a thing that happens around here. Oh. All right, so this presentation is called GOAT, or There Will Come Soft Rains. Some of you might get the reference there. That's another two-parter. Hopefully it won't run too long, but let's dive in here. So I know that a bunch of you are into science and science fiction. Raise your hands. Fans? Thought so? Okay. Let's start with a fun sci-fi question. How loud? By the way, am I too loud? How loud is humanity? Turns out this simple question isn't easily answered. We can calculate how signals attenuate, but we don't know how well they can be discerned from background noise in the universe. Frequently, when we think a signal is too weak to detect, we've developed new ways to parse it out. But one surprising fact is clear here. The more people we have, and the more advanced our technology, the quieter we get. And perhaps that's a natural consequence of how civilizations advance. And I know that comes to the question, like, what? How is that possible? Aren't we constantly getting louder as more people are spending more stuff over more technologies? We'll get into that. Let's start with the well-known problems with detectability. There's too much space, too much time. So first radio broadcast by humans, 1906, 120 years ago. So the volume to which that broadcast has reached now, over the 120 years, is 7 million cubic light years. The Milky Way galaxy contains 8 trillion cubic light years. Also, there's a problem of time here. Milky Way has existed for 13.6 billion years. And so we broadcast to less than 1 millionth of the galaxy for less than 100 millionth of its existence. And even with that, signals attenuate with distance. So those are kind of the problems that everyone knows, but they aren't the only problems. Let's recognize barriers to detectability. The more people there are, and the more technology advances, the more data we want to send. This is actually a problem. The bandwidth over which we can send is extremely limited. So we have to use it more and more efficiently. Often we avoid using it altogether by using wired connections instead. Even when we do use it, we broadcast with less and less power. The most powerful radio stations licensed in the United States generally broadcast at 50,000 watts of power. Those are usually used for huge, sparsely populated areas. By contrast, much of our data is now broadcast on cell phone cells that are smaller each year as more people send more data over. A final surprising barrier is the efficiency of our modern digital transmissions. The old analog encoder was very wasteful, of course. Digital encryption and compression is vastly more efficient and supports error detection and correction so we can ensure our data is transmitted correctly. This works great over the distance these systems are tuned for, but over cosmic distances, digital data breaks down into indecipherable noise. At those distances, analog's a lot better. The signal gets fuzzier and fuzzier, but there's so much duplication that it's possible it can still be picked out of the background radiation. Whether anyone can actually parse it, if there's anyone out there that can listen, is a question, but it seems plausible at least that with enough transmissions, and it's kind of like how we're, when we find tons of stone tablets of ancient language and we're starting to develop AIs and techniques that can actually parse languages out of them if you have enough data to work with. And it's possible that that's the case with the transmissions we set out in space as well. So now if we actually want to be heard, the gold standard is to do it intentionally and to do it hard. A very high power broadcast antenna tuned for a very narrow signal beam should actually be detectable anywhere we target it in our galaxy once it finally gets there. Several projects have been proposed to do this. For example, one to send repetitive pings to the million closest stars. These projects will be expensive, many billions of dollars a year, but they are possible with present technology. We have actually sent a couple of short messages to very close stars just to try it out. Overall, though, we're unsure if this is even a good idea, and there seems to be a little international will to do these projects. Next is what you might call omnidirectional intentional. So this is where you would build a broadcaster that's so powerful that it can send a detectable signal in all directions. This simply isn't possible with present technology. We're talking about like turning the moon into a transmitter and send like billions of watts of power. Theoretically, as advanced enough civilization could do that, but probably not anything that we can achieve right now. Then you've got narrow beam accidental. And so this is the case where, like, we send messages out to our deep space probes like Voyagers. And, the transmitter that we're sending out, the transmission signal that we're sending to Voyager 1 is 20,000 watts. What if it goes on beyond there? Could that hit somebody? Maybe. There's a couple problems there. One is that we're really only sending with enough power to reach our probe. We're not like adding a bunch of extra oomph to go out further. And then the other issue is that it's those messages, those signals are unlikely to hit anybody for the same reason the night sky is black. Most of space is empty, and most spots you're sending something to don't have a star system in the way. Could a signal ping somebody from this kind of situation? It's possible, not likely, but possible. So that leaves the last one. Omnidirectional accidental. Now this is a little interesting because it seems plausible that that this might be the best way. They do need a pretty strong signal to be reaching to like a different star system. So I'm going to dig into that. So with the question that builds off of that one is, will anyone hear any of our broadcasts from the heyday of ludicrously loud transmissions? We first developed the capability to send truly powerful radio signals in the 1930s. Our use of them was always limited and really started to drop off around the end of the Cold War. There's still a couple of powerful analog transmitters in use today. There's one in Russia called the Talon station. But the technology is really on the way out. Those 50 years or so, running from the 1930s to the 1980s, is really the prime time for powerful signals. When we were basically shouting, "We are here," out into the void. But your average like 50,000 watt powerful radio station in rural Nebraska isn't going to do. It's not going to be detectable light years away. It's really only signals that are much more powerful than that have a chance. And so that's something to think about. Okay. So I'm going to switch topics, but I'm going to do a little interlude here. For the next part to make sense, it'll help to understand a few things. And one of them is something from Josh's presentation, the placebo effect. We'll get to that. Sympathetic magic. Who's ever heard the term? Okay. Sympathetic magic is based off the strong tendency for people to associate things that are symbolically similar as though they're actually similar. For example, beet juice is red, like blood. Therefore, beet juice is good for treating blood disorders. I know that sounds ridiculous when laid out like that, but it's common in folk medicine and magic, running all the way from prehistory to the modern day. And there's the placebo effect, which of course, the phenomenon where a person's experiences a health improvement after receiving a treatment that has no inherent therapeutic value. And then there's the sunk cost fallacy. I'm calling this out specifically because it has an interaction with the placebo effect that's important and not often appreciated. If you spend $10 on a pill or a drink or something like that, how powerful is your urge to believe that had a beneficial effect? If you spend some medicine or something, $10 worth, it's not that significant. But if you sacrifice a lot for your treatments, then you have like an enormous need to believe that that treatment worked. And so that makes the placebo effect more potent, which makes a big difference in medical scams. So people have a long history of falling for medical scams. Whenever some important new fact or technique is discovered, it takes a while for it to be fully researched, tested, and integrated into modern medicine. That lifetime is usually 10 or 20 years on average. This is the perfect window for medical scammers to make a fortune. Bigger discovery, the bigger the scam feeding frenzy. I've heard of some of the some famous scams before. For example, electricity scams became trendy with the electrification of America. This terrifying device was the most popular electric belt of the time. It would supposedly cure your ills by shocking your abdomen and was an optional add-on your groin. So I'd actually heard of that one. I also heard of this one. With the discovery of radiation, people started selling highly radioactive drinking water, as well as treatments that gave a massive radiation dose to any part of your body that wasn't working right. But it turns out that I somehow missed out on the greatest medical scam of all time, the true GOAT of scams. And I think the reason it's not more well known is that we as a society instinctively memory hold it because too many people found it too embarrassing. So rather than just depending on one discovery like electricity or radiation, this one depended on two. Of course, surgery goes back to ancient times. You can find skulls with trepanation holes in them in like tribes and burial grounds. But three things became true in the early 1900s. Physiological knowledge, so the surgeon actually had a reasonable shot at doing something. Local and general anesthetics, so surgery wasn't like vivisection. And antiseptics, so the patient actually had a good chance of survival. Those came together about 120 years ago, roughly. So there was a surgeon interested in surgery, and scammers jumped right in. Suddenly, surgery could solve anything. Then, in the 19-teens, researchers started to realize that there were chemicals in the blood, and chemicals seemed to do things, important things. They also seemed to be secreted by small structures that they ended up turning glands. But at that time, nobody really knew how it worked, or anything about it really. Another perfect opportunity for a scam. So, enter a genius. If you're already a medical scammer in 1917, you actually have basic surgical skills. How do you take advantage of this rare situation? Medical scams run on vanity and desperation, sure. And people are primed to and ready to believe that new magical techniques of surgery can solve their problems. Many of them start hearing new hormone things that are important too somehow. Combine surgery, endocrinology, vanity, and fear into an invasive procedure that your customer would be too embarrassed to admit didn't work. One man pulled it all together. John Romulus Brinkley. And Brinkley picked the perfect subject for his scam. Virility. And remember, this is still a heavily agricultural society. What reads virile to people who are still familiar with farms?
I'm trying to, I can't.
Oh. Yes, these are exactly what you think they are. Goat glands. And in case you were thinking we've advanced as a society and wouldn't fall for goat-based virility treatments, well, I was disappointed but not surprised that the specialty meat seller I ordered these from directly advertises them as containing bioactive testosterone and being good for male virility. Cooking, digestion, and basic biology don't work this way. Ladies and gentlemen, the internet was a mistake. So, in 1917, Dr. Brinkley set himself up in a small town of Milford, Kansas, and got his clinic off to a roaring start. He started off aiming primarily at older farmers and ranchers, people watching their youth slip away with enough money to spring for what was at the time quite an expensive surgery, like buy a new car expensive surgery. In the early days, you weren't you were actually required to provide your own goat. I'm dead serious. Generally, very young goats were used, so they were small enough that the entire gland could be extracted and added to a human. So as the procedures grew in popularity, Brinkley came up with many variations. Of course, he started selling it for more than virility. Eventually, he sold it to cure cancer, heart disease, reverse aging, and improve general health. He also eventually sold a version for women that is more or less what you'd expect, and so on and so forth. Wait, how does this work? Simple. Bring the patient and their goat into the operating theater. Give local anesthesia to both of them. Because heaven knows you wouldn't want to sleep through the excitement. Remove gland from the goat and add it to the human. Sometimes it was sewn in, sometimes it was simply dropped. Wait, how? How does anyone survive this? We have trouble even getting people to survive with transplanted human organs. Turns out a goat gland is luckily too foreign. The body treats it as dead tissue, forms a cyst around it, and breaks it down over a few months. Except when it didn't. Brinkley performed around 4,000 goat gland transplants over his 20-year career. In later legal proceedings, he was found to have caused at least 42 deaths, and the real number is probably much higher than that. He worked pretty hard on cover-ups, but was protected by the Kansas state government because of how much money he was pulling into the Kansas economy. By some definitions, Brinkley is among America's most prolific and weirdest serial killers. How did this become popular? It wasn't just the perfect procedure at the perfect time. Brinkley essentially invented modern radio. Almost the very first radio advertisements were for Brinkley's gland procedures, and included the enthusiastic testaments of his patients. He flooded the airwaves in a way no one had ever heard. Then he figured out how to interweave advertising, music, and Christian sermons into a seamless package perfectly tuned for his Kansas audience. What music? Brinkley was too cheap to pay for jazz, blues, and dance band music that was popular at the time, so he went counterculture. He started out to hire the local hillbilly musicians as filler. As that proved popular, he leaned into it. He started to pull and popularize similar musicians from all over. The hillbilly music became country and western. Almost all of the first generation of country music artists got their start on Brinkley's radio stations. These included the first of the singing cowboys, Gene Autry, the Carter family, including June Carter, later June Carter Cash. We'll start over there. And it wasn't just farmers getting them. Speculation about famous people getting gland implants literally appeared on the front page of the New York Times in June 1922. While most big names kept their implants on the down low, two of the men who went public were U.S. Senators Wesley Staley, Colorado, and LA Times owner Harry Chandler. Other likely recipients included famous actors and members of the traditional imperial royal family of China. Because why not? Now, why Milford? Wouldn't somewhere richer make more sense? Brinkley was a generally practical man. There were lots of goats around, successful farmers who had just enough money to be worth scamming, and because Brinkley couldn't get in where he really wanted to go, Chicago. Brinkley tried to move his business to Chicago twice. Both times he was driven out by two facts. One, it was the headquarters of the Journal American Medical Association. Its editor, Morris Fishbein, fought tooth and nail against medical scams. Indeed, eventually brought Brinkley down in the late 30s. That epic tale is too long and will be left for interested viewers to follow up on. I have some book recommendations. The other problem is that in Chicago was the local competition. And I have to mention that competition. So Chicago competitor number one, Dr. G.F. Livingston. He was a true believer, also a complete hack, and he specialized in human-to-human gland transplants. He is recorded to have given himself at least 7 extra glands. 1 in the usual spot and 3 on each side of his rib cage. He performed all surgeries on himself because he didn't want anyone stealing his secrets. I think one of those secrets has to be where he was getting human glands from. He claimed to his patients that they were all coming from, quote, young, healthy, recently executed death row inmates. but it seems much more likely he was stealing them from cadavers at Chicago hospitals where he worked. So protect your body when you're dead at Chicago hospitals. That's the secret here. Here's a newspaper article from the time. The second Chicago competitor was Dr. Max Thorpe, trained at Rush Medical College, founded the American Hospital, now known as Thorpe Memorial in Uptown, founded the International College of Surgeons, and was a legit real surgeon. He thought goat glands were too inhuman to work, and human glands were impractical for pretty obvious reasons. So he eventually settled on our closest relatives, chimpanzees. He ran into two problems. One, he actually used the scientific method and had endless trouble duplicating the amazing results everyone else was claiming. And the second problem is chimps. Chimps are humans' closest ape relative, which means they are strong, aggressive, and terribly violent. It turns out nothing fights as hard when you try to take its glands as a male chimp. Dr. Thorpe had to develop complicated safety procedures to even attempt the operations, and to store the chimps for that matter. They stayed in a large enclosure on the roof of the hospital. Except when they didn't. In 1923, one chimp escaped while being moved. Articles from the Times say it was pursued through the streets by the CBD and eventually, supposedly, 5,000 Chicago residents. I like to imagine that looks something like this. So eventually the chimp climbed the bell tower at St. Mary's the Lake Catholic Church to escape. And here's a clip from an article at the time. When he flees hospital and apparently eventually went there. I really want you to think this through. In 1923, the Chicago Police Department and 5,000 people chased a chimpanzee castration candidate through the streets of Uptown until it climbed the bell tower of a Catholic church. And then it happened again. This time, all of the chimpanzees escaped the rooftop enclosure, climbed down the side of the hospital, and again invaded the same church during Sunday morning services. That prompted this remarkable statement from Dr. Thorpe. Anytime you start to think that the world is sane and rational, I want you to remember that a crowd of chimps once desecrated a Catholic church in Uptown. Anyway, back to Dr. Brinkley. We're going to gloss over the rest of his colorful tale. He finally lost his medical license in Kansas in 1930. He immediately ran for governor as a write-in candidate, invented a good chunk of modern political advertising at the time. Remember, he's a genius. And by all accounts at the time, he actually won. But the Kansas Democratic and Republican parties worked together with the outgoing administration to change the voting rules to get rid of write-in candidacy at the last minute and throw out most of his votes. So he didn't win. Let's see. Yeah, so he fled Kansas, moved to Texas, Mexico, Texas border, starts a new hospital and a new border blaster radio station broadcasting from Mexico. In 1938, he was driven out of Mexico by the American government. He relocated to Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1939, he was driven out of business by lawsuits and fish bean from the Journal of American Medical Association, and dies penniless in 1942. This presentation started because I heard an odd and disturbing fact. Nazi Germany began broadcasting propaganda worldwide in the mid-1930s using powerful radio transmitters. It's been suggested that the very first transmissions that any alien civilization is likely to receive from humanity were ETs, because they were the first sent at a sufficient level of power. Shit. However, when you dig into it further, you find it's not actually true. From 1934 to 1939, WLW Cincinnati operated at 500,000 watts before dropping down to more typical 50,000 limit. It broadcast a pretty typical variety of music, news, shows, and sports. So at the same time as the Nazis, but significantly better content. Was that the first? No. If you dig into the memory hole, you find the truth. Brinkley's Forward blaster radio station in Mexico went to 1,000,000 watts in October of 1932, and he broadcast from it with sister stations for much of the 1930s. Its signal was so powerful it was sometimes listened to as far away as Europe. In addition to drowning out all the nearby stations, it was apparently pumping out so much force that it turned any nearby wiring into resonators. The station began to receive complaints from the nearby town that Brinkley was now audible frying, wire fencing, bed springs, and dental appliances. You know, all this talk of history and space puts me in mind of the long term. After all, species come and species go. I hope humanity is different, but probably not. If someday we go extinct, what's left? When our machines grind to a halt for the last time and the streets grow quiet and there come soft rains, what mark have we left on the universe? Now we know the true legacy of all humankind is unveiled at last. An ever-spreading electromagnetic shock wave of goat testicle implantation advertisements carried to the stars on the sweet harmonies of the singing cowboys. Few things I've learned in my life have pleased me as much as finding the perfect epitaph for the human race has already been spoken by ourselves. Thank you. Anyone hungry? There's still kids that thrive. I think it's those.
Question.
Yep.
Did you buy those for this presentation, and when are you going to do it like now?
I did buy them exactly for this presentation, for God's sake, man. And I don't know what to do with them. I literally considered bringing a fryer up and frying them, since they should be harmless to eat, but it seemed like a little too much effort. But yes, if anyone wants to experiment with cooking them, they should still be perfectly good. Any other questions? Nope. All right. Thank you.
That's making me nervous.
Yes.